with.
Joining me now for a fair and balanced debate, Richard Socarides, former special assistant to President Bill Clinton and a Democratic strategist, and David Webb, host of the David Webb Show on Sirius XM's Patriot Channel and Tea Party 365 co-founder. That to me, when I looked over the evidence of whether he contradicted himself, when he told Congress that he'd never been involved in or heard of the potential prosecution of the press. And then I see the FBI affidavit he signed off on says specifically because of Rosen's own potential criminal liability in this matter. That is pretty darn close to a direct contradiction. Richard, your thoughts as somebody who's not only a Democrat but a lawyer?
Well, I would say that, first of all, I would say that this is a very serious territory. And I'm sure that the Attorney General will address it directly because he will have to. But I would say that what he probably will say is that it's all a matter of context and that the material, the quoted material, the testimony was about whether or not they were going to prosecute a reporter, and reporters, in fact, have not been prosecuted. But the other language was used to support the subpoena, the issuance of a subpoena, and not in furtherance of a prosecution.
He was talking about the AP case when he gave that congressional testimony, not necessarily about the Rosen case, which we didn't know about yet at the time.
Well, I think he will say that in the Rosen case, the so-called Rosen case, that the leaker, the alleged leaker, was prosecuted, but the reporter, Mr. Rosen, was not prosecuted, and that they never had any intention to prosecute him, even though...
I get you, but what he told Congress was with respect to the potential prosecution of the press for disclosures. That's something I've never even heard of.
Well, we can't get in his mind, but I think he will say that there was never any contemplated prosecution of the press, that language...
Okay, let me stop you there. There was never any contemplated prosecution of the press. Then why, in that second full screen that I showed, did he say that Rosen had potential criminal liability?
I think
liability is different. It's not just saying he's a co-conspirator and I think he's a criminal, but I'm never going to prosecute him. This is saying the man's got potential criminal liability, and that's why we can't alert him to the warrant.
You're absolutely right. And I think he will say that the existence of potential criminal liability is very different from the existence of an actual prosecution.
An actual right. And if he had said to Congress, I've never heard of the actual prosecution, he'd be fine. But what he said was, I've never heard of the potential prosecution of the press.
And this is why it's a problem.
That's why, I'm trying to be fair to him and drill down on the actual language, because when you have a perjury case, a potential perjury case, that's what you do. The language matters.
Right. Yeah.
And I got to be honest, David, I looked at it yesterday, I said, all right, if he just calls Rosen an aider and abettor in a paper through his FBI guy, that's not necessarily it, because you could be saying the guy's an aider and abettor, and I'm never going to go after him. But let me tell you, Judge, he's an aider and abettor, and this is why we should look at his emails. But when he takes it a step further and says, and he's got potential criminal liability in this matter, that to me is arguably directly contradictory to that testimony he gave to Congress about, I've never prosecution of the press for disclosures.
Whether you start from a point of incompetence or deliberate behavior, let's go by what he said in the context of which he did say it. And the argument of context does not work when you go to what you talk about. This is beyond belief when you have the most political attorney general who has decided to use the power of the office and say that either we do know what we're doing, but when we don't need to know, and when you have caught us at something, we don't know what we're doing. Which one do you want to believe? That Holder's decided to name and sign off on naming a member of the press who has the right to ask a question, doesn't have to be answered. He flatters a guy at the State Department. He tries to get information. That's what reporters do. But this is also the reporter that reported on the White House war on Fox when they attacked Fox directly. This administration believes in payback, Megyn. And they are using the arm of government, whether it's Holder, the IRS, Benghazi, Civil Rights Division. Look at their track record. Don't just look at the incident here. We have to look at the facts here. They matter, and whether he perjured himself or not. But look at the facts of this administration, that they do exercise payback using government and the bureaucracies as the oppressor.
What do you make of now even some liberal outlets like the Huffington Post, Jonathan Turley? Jonathan Turley it openly says, I'm no conservative or Republican.
Well, he has a very eclectic mix of views, Mr. Turley.
He says, but, he's not a right-leaning guy. He's upset with Holder from his position on the left. But the Huffington Post, Richard, saying he's got to go.
Well, Listen, I think there are certainly very serious questions that he will have to answer, and I think that he's already started to say that this is an area in which some mistakes were made. But I think, on the big picture on these relations with the press and press subpoenas, I mean, this balancing between freedom of the press and national security is always a balance.
We know
and
that.
when there's a balance, it would suggest that there's some gray areas, and I think he will say in the coming days that mistakes were made.
But
and he's already saying that. Okay, so he's already coming out and sort of
He's
trying
walking
to.
it back.
He's trying
This
to.
is
Yeah.
fast and
I mean,
furious
the Daily
walk it
Beast.
back,
I've mentioned this a few times, but the Daily Beast article talks about the gravity of the situation didn't fully sink in until Monday morning. He began to feel a creeping sense of personal remorse. Look, we get it now. We understand. This is a teaching moment. His own personal soul searching has already begun. In retrospect, he believes he may have crossed the line. On and on it goes.
No.
I mean, is that good enough?
No. Personal remorse, not even there, Megan. We're talking about someone who has a record from the Clinton years, who has a record in the Obama administration. And to give him the creeping remorse when actions go against that, whether you start with Fast and Furious, whether you go back before that, Civil Rights Division, look at what they do, not just who we want them to be. They can't be, with all due respect, the guys that know the system are supposed to use the system. These are signed off up the chain. This is a systemic problem. And it's not one low-level employee going, let me issue a subpoena, and it goes to Holder.
No.
It gets reviewed along the way. So let's follow the process, follow the evidence
Well, and
where
that's
it
one of the
leads,
questions
and
that I
start at the
continue to
bottom.
have. How many of us have you done this to? What are the names and how many times has it happened?
Well,
and you tell me, Richard, as he does his little roundtable with reporters, now he wants to meet with the D.C. bureau chiefs now that he's been caught in these two scandals and get our input on, what he should do with respect to his own guidelines. Well, you know what? It's not the guidelines that matter. It's your discretion. You're the top law enforcement officer. You make the call. But here's the question. I think you don't begin that conversation until you say, Mr. Holder, you first. How many of us have you done this to? How widespread is this scandal? How often do you employ this tool? Is it just Rosen and the AP? First, you got to admit the scope of the problem and understand it before you can try to heal it.
I think those are excellent questions. I think they're very legitimate. And, whether he answers them first or whether they, go back and forth on this, I think, this is an area where obviously I really, I too believe that some mistakes were made. And I guess the answers to the questions that David raised will all depend upon whether or not you believe this is a man who's got a long record in government, who's trying to do the right thing in a very complicated world and a very complicated job, or whether you believe he comes at this with, an effort to hurt his political opponents. I myself believe that he's a good guy in a complicated job who mostly gets it right. And sometimes mistakes are made. And, he will have a lot of explaining to do.
Yeah, he's there. He's in that position. It's starting. I got to go. Thank you both so much. Great to see you. Coming up, the family of an American mother